Okay, so, oh no, I clicked the wrong one. So luckily I have a stick.
Oh, you put the wrong one on the computer.
I think I did. So I have the new one here.
Oh, it's not true. The first one.
I could switch, yeah, but. I think it's a good example of why you want to have titles that have something other than numbers differentiating them, kind of thing at the end. I have a really old stick, and so it's not quite fitting. So I need a.
You need what?
I'm just going to read it off my stick. Is that okay?
Absolutely. Let me just be sure this works. Do you think that's plugged in now?
It'll say Kingston.
Kingston there, okay. And
okay. Here we go.
that's the one you want?
That's the one I want.
All right.
Okay. Thanks, Bruce.
You bet.
Okay. So, so let's go back to this. Let's do the right paper. So, so at least among economists, debates about the public debt, or in debates about public debt, issues of timing consistency and reputation are often given a prominent role. And Hamilton's report on public credit is often cited as an early acknowledgement or recognition of these issues. But from the very beginning, front and center in public debate about the public debt are distributional issues. And so, Hamilton's initial plan to service the Revolutionary War debt was very controversial. There was a lot of debate. There's a guy named Robert Livingston who argued or proposed alternative to Hamilton's plan that focused entirely on distributional issues. And he reported statistics about how skewed the ownership of the public debt was. And he used that as a basis for his opposition to Hamilton's plan. Historians will argue that, well, maybe you should take Livingston's opposition with a grain of salt because he was a political rival of Hamilton and wanted the job that Hamilton ultimately got. But I don't think it was just professional sour grapes, what he was talking about. I think those were issues that were important. It wasn't just Livingston. James Madison also proposed some amendments unsuccessfully to Hamilton's plan that were based on what he perceived as some injustices, distributional injustices associated with Hamilton's plan. And then, of course, most famously, there's a historian named Charles Beard, who wrote an entire book arguing that all this lofty rhetoric about checks and balances, and reputation and so forth, which is subterfuge. What the Constitution was just a document that served the narrow financial interest. What did I do? Did I do something?
I didn't see you do anything, but that.
Oh, maybe it's the stick. I'm reading off the stick.
Liz?
Okay, good. I'll try to be gentle. So anyway, so there's this book that says, this Constitution was just a document that served the financial interests of the founding fathers. So what I'm trying to say is that these distributional issues have been central to debates about the public debt. But the sad fact is, economic models historically have been totally incapable of addressing these issues that seem to be really important. So here's how Lucas and Stokey conclude their paper on optimal fiscal policy. They say, by considering a closed system with identical consumers, we have abstracted from consideration of conflict between a creditor class and a debtor class, a conflict on which historical discussion of national debt policy has been almost exclusively focused. We have, in short, restricted attention to situations in which the half-truth, we only owe it to ourselves, becomes a whole truth. Here's what Sargent says in his Nobel address. Why then did the framers choose to keep some promises, once to its creditors, by breaking other promises, those to continental taxpayers, that had been protected by the Articles of Confederation? To understand why Hamilton and Washington and other framers wanted to pay, we have to take into account heterogeneities of economic situations, as well as reputational considerations that are absent from these Ramsey models. So my reading of this paper is that it's allowing us, it's getting us started and allowing us to address these issues, distributional issues that have always been front and center in debates about the public debt. And I think that's the key thing. So, so this is a paper on learning and expectations in macroeconomics. I suspect many of you are like me and a bit of an outsider to this literature. I know you're supposed to skip quickly over reference slides, but I'm actually not going to do that. I'm going to spend just a couple minutes on this. Partly because I think this paper is part of a natural progression in this literature, which provides a nice illustration of an old argument of Lucas, that economics largely progresses by outward shifts of the methodological production possibilities frontier, and that's what this paper really is. So, the starting point in all the modern literature on public debt is Barrow's famous Ricardian equivalence paper. In that paper, government debt is totally irrelevant because he assumes the government has lump sum taxes, and kind of the punchline there that's true even if people have finite horizons as long as they care about their kids. So, so the next step is to recognize that taxes aren't lump sum. The question is, maybe why? But so Barrow next went to a model with distorting taxes. He uses earlier work to defend this idea of a single representative household with infinite horizon. And in that model, the debt is definitely not irrelevant. It plays a very important role, much like wealth does to a permanent income consumer. It's allowing the government to smooth its taxes intertemporally. And kind of from an empirical standpoint, the interesting feature of that model is that there's a lot of history dependence built into debt and taxes. They're a function of the entire past. They have unit roots, and they depend on the entire past history of shocks to government spending. Okay, but you might question, and Lucas and Stokey did, why restrict the financial market structure so drastically? How would things change if you had a richer financial market structure? Governments issue more than just one period debt. So that's what Lucas and Stokey did. They retained,
Push the big flat square thing.
This? Oh, that was easy.
Relax. There you go.
Okay. So anyway, so that's what Lucas and Stokey do. They go to effectively complete market setup. They retain the representative agent fiction. And what they find is that you get a drastic version of tax smoothing. Not only do you smooth taxes across time, but you're going to smooth them across states. And there's a lot of methodological breakthroughs in that paper. But if you're an empirical person, you could argue it was a bit of a step backwards. Why? Because in these complete market settings, government debt, is an entirely forward-looking object. I mean, it's completely divorced from the past. It's history independence, right? That doesn't seem to be a feature in the data. So the next step was a paper by Aigari, Marcet, Sargent, and Seppala. They kind of go back to the Barrow 79 paper. They retain a lot of the formalism of Lucas and Stokey's paper. And they just shut down some financial markets, a lot of them. So they kind of go back to the Barrow 79 financial market structure. And subject to some technical qualifications, they largely reinstate Barrow's earlier results about history dependence. Okay, so this is taking us into the 21st century. These are all representative agent models, though, right? They're not going to address the response to Hamilton's plan and that sort of thing, right? So a paper by Yvonne Merning, who's one of the leaders of this new dynamic public finance literature, it kind of builds on this other literature from public finance, Mirrlees and so forth, where why restrict the government to have distorting taxes? The use of distorting taxes should be endogenous. So the idea is, what Merning does is say, well, the government can have lump sum taxes if they want, but you introduce heterogeneity into the economy, and you have a government that cares about distribution. The punchline in this literature is that the government optimally chooses not to use lump sum taxes because distorting taxes serve a useful redistributional role. So, but that's like they go back to Lucas and Stokey, and he has complete markets, and for the same gets the same result, which is from an empirical standpoint, there may be some problems with this, and that you're back to this Ricardian equivalence setting with lump sum taxes. So when we finally get to this paper, This paper, it kind of does what the AMS paper did. They're just going to shut down some markets. And you get a version of something what you might argue is like transfer smoothing. But what I think is really interesting, the new twist in this paper is that there's the ownership structure of the government debt becomes important. And that's what that debate was all about. So the other reason I went through all that is that kind of the ingredients of the model are largely borrowed from, and I think that's useful from these previous papers. There's some interesting and important new twists though. The agents like in Verning's paper differ by productivity and wealth. Productivity is stochastic here, unlike Verning, and it has both aggregate and idiosyncratic components. And that's going to be important because what you tend to see in the data is that not all these aggregate risks hit everybody in the same way, that they have distributional consequences as well, which fiscal policy may want to respond to. It's a Ramsey planner, so this guy can commit. Martin Ellison's not going to like this, but that's what they do. Taxes are restricted to be affine functions of labor income. And so the affine word is actually important. That the government could use lump sum taxes if they wanted to. Oh, Jesus. Okay. I squander all my time with technological ineptness. So there's going to be debt limits, no default, government expenditure. Okay. Well, this last one is actually kind of important. There's a single asset with a stochastic, state-independent payoff. Returns on the asset can are going to be kind of used at the government as a financial head. And Mueller, if you went over that. Okay. So the analysis in the paper is how you go about resolving these various tensions and trade-offs in an optimal way. The basic kind of trade-off is that labor taxes distort incentives, but they potentially facilitate redistributive goals. It's like, Verning's paper. There's a common lump sum transfers. They don't distort incentives, but they might conflict with your redistributive goals. And so the whole game here is to try to balance these things in an optimal way. It turns out that the combination depends on the correlation between asset payoffs and government expenditures. The paper works through two cases, one where those payoffs are exogenous because of linear preferences, and another one where they're endogenous. Okay. So what's the main results? Well, with a common lump sum taxes and transfers, like I said, the ownership structure becomes important. And in fact, in some sense, in some cases, it becomes more important than the level of debt itself. And in particular, you can argue you can support this idea that a widely held debt is less distortioning to redistributive government. So here's a quote from not an economist, but a well-known public statesman. So here's what Abraham Lincoln said in his State of the Union address in December 1864. He said, "If the public debt has become a substantial branch of national though private property, for obvious reasons, the more nearly this property can be distributed among all the people, the better." It was obvious to Lincoln, but it's something that doesn't show up in economic models. It does in this one. And what's really interesting is if you proceed to read the rest of the address, he proposes kind of a subsidy scheme to encourage low-income households to buy government bonds, which was actually implemented. Of course, he didn't live to see it through. So that's what I like about this paper. You get these features that seem so resoundingly obvious, but they're not in models yet. So, okay, so since I'm running out of time, I think I'm going to skip this. Anmol already kind of went over this. Okay, so this perturbation, if you're a technical guy, which I'm not, you're going to like this paper for entirely different reasons, maybe. It borrows from what David was talking about earlier this morning. As a consumer of these methods, though, I was just going to say something. I'll say something now what I was going to say earlier. I think it'd be interesting to you might argue like not the state of the art, but kind of the industry standard for applying these methods is Crisell and Smith's, matching the moment sort of thing. And it would be nice to see a case where this method clearly dominates those methods, and I'll just say that now. So here's the empirical strategy. It's kind of a four-step strategy. They're going to estimate reduced foreign policy rules to observe data over this period 78 to 2010. It'd be great if you could have a longer time series because most of the action in this sort of domain take place during wars and stuff. But their hands are tied in terms of what's available in terms of they want to focus on cross-sectional stuff. So there's nothing they can really do about that at this point. Choose parameters so that outcomes given these rules match selected moments. Anytime you do that, the question is why these moments and not others, but I'm not going to go into that. Given these parameter values, calculate the optimal policy. And then, Enmal didn't have time to really go into it, but then they're going to compare the optimal policy. He gave you one table at the end about this, with the observed policy, okay? So it's one of those things, well, is the government behaving optimally, right? One of the novel results of this paper is that when recessions are accompanied by greater skill inequality, it is optimal to respond to recessions by issuing debt, increasing transfers, and increasing taxes. Okay, thank you. And that's not what, that's not what you get out of current models, right? So I think that's interesting. Oh, geez, well, I'm not going to be able to talk about this. This is a conference on expectations. So I have kind of a throwaway slide saying, expectations are important in this model. They're really important. It's this Ramsey problem. The government, central bankers like to refer to this as shaping expectations. Well, there's a lot of shaping of expectations in this model. But then that raises the question about what would happen if the government can't commit. And one of the new things that you could do in this sort of paper is how much worse off would people be, but more interestingly, would some people be hurt more than others? Could reputation provide a substitute? Do distributional concerns make it harder to cultivate a reputation? Okay, so I think that might be interesting. All right, so here's a couple comments and questions in like 90 seconds. There's some interesting methodological parallels between this paper and Enmal's other paper. They both feature endogenous Pareto weights and endogenous wealth distribution dynamics. You have to respect this implementability constraint. So the obvious thing you can do would be, it might be interesting to calculate something like a robust fiscal policy, because if you follow these debates in the last few years, model uncertainty seems to be just like an obvious feature, element of the debate, and so it might be interesting to do that at some point. There's an old interesting paper by Bisetto and Kocher-Lakota that argues that the distribution of government debt is irrelevant, even when taxes are distortionary, if taxes can be indexed to previous income. So a question would be, would allowing history dependence in taxes and transfers, Social Security, for example, is indexed to previous earnings. So how would that affect some of these answers to these questions? I'm not a public finance guy, so there's no consumption taxes here. I'm not sure how restrictive that is, but consumption taxes seem to be a feature of real tax systems and are often argued to be less distortionary, and if structured properly might serve redistributive goals as well. So that might be. So I don't know what the answer to that is. And then it might be pushing the model too hard. One question: the whole point of having a model like this, in some sense, you get this discrepancy between what's optimal and what you see. So one thing you could do, the way the paper is currently written is that they're just comparing impulse response functions and moments and so forth. But it'd be nice to see how much does it really matter. The half-life is 500 and something years, suppose it was something else, closer to maybe what you see in the data. So how much cost would that inflict on the agents in the economy? You're all set up to answer those questions in a model like that. And then finally, I'm going to conclude with a totally cheap shot. Two issues have dominated recent debates about fiscal policy: distributional concerns, and this paper nails that. It's addressed the first paper, really, formal paper, that allows us to get a handle on those issues. But the other part of the debate is all about macroeconomic stabilization, right? This paper doesn't do that. At least, well, depending on your philosophy, I guess. It doesn't do that. There are aggregate shocks going on and stuff, but there's no stabilization role for fiscal policy here, right? So, it'd be nice to have a framework at some future time point where you can address both issues simultaneously. So that's my cheap shot.